Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. So I want to start today's show with a story. It's a story I just heard from a public defender contact of mine out in California. They recently had a case representing a man who you would think would be treated with care by the system because of his vulnerabilities. A man in a wheelchair, diabetic, high blood pressure, a ton of risk factors for a really bad outcome if he were to be exposed to COVID-19. He was trapped in jail in the middle of a pandemic, not because of any kind of new crime, but rather because of a warrant on an old case. This is a person who checks every box for emergency release, for relief during a pandemic, because COVID-19 is especially deadly for people who have comorbidities like this. With that in mind, you might think that his judge would allow him to return home so that he could remain safe while facing his charges. But in fact, that judge held him in jail for months, putting him at risk of death every day. I hear stories like this way more than I want to from public defender friends across the country, of vulnerable people who are being subjected to tortuous conditions in jail for reasons that are impossible to justify. Jails are horrifying, dangerous places under the best of circumstances. They are overcrowded, unsanitary, often with very limited access to medical care. Jails are responsible for mental health crises, outbreaks of communicable diseases, and not to mention all of the other fallout, right? Loss of housing, loss of employment, loss of your benefits, food stamps, family contacts, education. Your whole future can go down the drain if you are held in a jail. There's almost nothing in a person's life that can't be ruined by jail, and that is under normal non-pandemic conditions. Now, here's the thing. Jails are built to primarily hold people who have not been convicted of a crime. People who are, I will remind you, innocent until proven guilty in the eyes of our law. That's nearly 75% of the jail population. 500,000 people who are actually being held before they've ever been brought to trial, before they've been found guilty of anything. The vast majority of people in jail simply don't need to be there and wouldn't be there if they had enough money to buy their freedom in the form of paying bail. Many are being detained on nonviolent or other low-level charges and could be released without any risk to the community. For these reasons, advocates have been urging officials to alleviate jail overcrowding, and they were pushing for that long before COVID-19 hit. The basic idea is that more people in jail means less space per person, fewer resources, worse conditions, and treatment for everyone. But in the early spring of 2019, with COVID-19 outbreaks already spreading across the country and into local jails, some officials began taking steps to decarcerate in an attempt to spare people the risk of infection behind bars and also prevent jails from becoming hotspots that would spread to the broader community. These efforts had an immediate effect. By the end of April, jail populations in some jurisdictions had reached their lowest levels in years. But even though the pandemic worsened, the declines didn't last. Over the second half of 2020, jail populations in many places crept back up to their pre-pandemic levels. Mind you, the pandemic has not gone away. So in New York City, where I used to be a public defender, jail populations dropped. They did this. They dropped at the beginning of the pandemic, but after a rollback to a recent bail law, the population spiked again, rose 16% in just the first 100 days after those reforms were reversed. And it's not just New York. A recent report by Jerry Iannelli in The Appeal found that jail populations in many jurisdictions have returned to, and even in some cases, surpassed pre-pandemic levels. Others have seen their numbers swell over the second half of 2020. And while they may not have hit their pre-pandemic levels, these disturbing increases are still placing jails at risk of COVID outbreaks nearly a year into the pandemic. But beyond the immediate risk, these trends also reflect a sad reality. Officials have apparently learned nothing from the pandemic. They were apparently only willing to do the lip service of reducing jail populations temporarily and have shown no newfound understanding of the ways in which overcrowded jails function as a toxic aspect of the legal system, unnecessarily harming people, inhibiting their access to justice, and failing to keep us all safe. So here to talk about that today, with details to discuss concerning these trends, we've got Gordon Weeks, the Chief Public Defender in Broward County, Florida, Ricardo García, the Chief Public Defender in Los Angeles County, and Jerry Iannelli, that very writer I talked about a minute ago, a reporter here at The Appeal. Thank you all so much for joining me today. So, Jerry, let's start with you. The trends that we're talking about are based in large part on your recent reporting. And I'd love for you to help us understand what is happening here, why this is happening. How did officials go from conceding that jails are cesspools and releasing people to then just totally doubling back on that and filling the jails right back up?
So, yeah, as you said, I looked at essentially the 20 largest cities in America, or counties or municipalities, depending on how you want to classify it. And in almost every single case, this includes New York City, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Dallas, Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Orlando, Tampa, populations dropped, as you said, and people seem to be taking the pandemic very seriously and seem to be recognizing that jails and prisons, given the conditions you described, were going to be incubators for the virus. There were, pretty large-scale series of releases that occurred, March, April 2020. And those were mostly of quote unquote nonviolent detainees, people held on low-level charges, traffic charges, drug charges, those types of charges. And essentially about midway through the year, it seems like most jurisdictions kind of hit a wall in terms of the types of people, held on certain charges they were going to be willing to release. A lot of prosecutors and judicial systems basically said that they just were going to take a hard line on anyone, perhaps held on felony charges or held on quote unquote violent charges. And basically about halfway through the year, it seems like populations in most jurisdictions just kind of stopped moving. And then about, for the second half of 2020 into today, those populations started rising again. And in a lot of cities, they've started rising, but they haven't really hit back to their pre-pandemic levels, like Los Angeles County's example of that. Where it had been, and Ricardo, correct me if I'm wrong, but had been at about 1,700 or 17,000, dropped to about 12 or 13, and then now is back up, according to today, at about 15,000 people. But there are other cities, look at New York, Chicago, Houston, where jails have not only swelled back to their pre-pandemic levels, but actually gone higher. And so if we were taking this seriously and saying, that people not convicted of crimes, perhaps don't deserve to be punished before that happens. We have basically recreated the conditions that were spreading the pandemic in March and April of 2020 in virtually every major city in the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? We haven't discovered some sort of magic spray that just eradicates the risk of COVID in jails. The cells haven't gotten any bigger. There aren't more toilets. You're still 40 people sharing a toilet. And additionally, we haven't reached a point where any of these people have been found guilty of wrongdoing, certainly not in a way that would, put their lives at risk or justify putting their lives at risk. So, Gordon, I want to talk with you about what's happening in Broward County, Florida, the Fort Lauderdale area. Can you give us a play-by-play of how things transpired last year, a year ago, when it was clear that the pandemic was going to be a real threat to communities, and that included how you got your county to believe that included people who were incarcerated?
Early on in the pandemic, this jurisdiction worked very, very hard to address this issue of the jail population. The very few first weeks of the pandemic, court personnel were in court until 9, 10 o'clock at night, trying to address those folks, get them hearings before the court, and to get them released from jail on some form of pretrial release. That was the initial thrust, to recognize that jails needed to have more space to make sure that folks had enough room to properly socially distance and to reduce the likelihood of spread of the virus within a very strong, small confines of the jail. And there was a lot of work done towards that. And folks were released. The numbers were at an all-time low here in Broward County with respect to the jail population. But very shortly thereafter, folks are just hard to break bad habits, started rearresting, started sending more folks back to jail for very minor nonviolent offenses. We took a lot of steps here to encourage law enforcement to issue notice to appear in lieu of physical arrest, because we recognize for a minor offense, the individual still would have the opportunity to have their day in court, but they did not ordinarily need to be taken to jail. in during the pandemic, especially if it was a minor offense and it was not a threat to public safety or to the community. Those notices to appear, it requires a lot of coordination in a county this large to get all of the law enforcement agencies, because we have a sheriff, but we also have a number of municipalities that are led by their own chiefs of police. And to coordinate those efforts, to have them all be marching on the same drum to reduce the jail population is difficult because you have certain jurisdictions, certain bad and historical practices where it's easy for law enforcement to throw someone in the car and take them down for the ride. But we have to do things differently. We have to address the realities of the pandemic, but more importantly, we have to learn from the realities of the pandemic. The pandemic has forced this criminal justice system, not only in Broward, but across the nation, to look at incarceration of folks for very non-violent offenses pre-trial. And when there was a reduction in jail population here in Broward County, there was not a corresponding increase in violent crime throughout the community. So the pandemic has shown a number of communities all throughout the country that you can have a different approach to arresting someone. You can give them a notice to appear. You can release them on some form of release other than bond. You can place them on a pretrial release with some form of monitoring, and they can be safe in the community. That will assure their return to court to answer for the charges. But you do not have to fill up the jails with folks that have very minor charges that are going to have to make some very difficult decisions about whether they are going to take a plea in order to get back home with their family or their job or the responsibilities of bills that are waiting, or whether they are going to stand and face those charges to appropriately and adequately fight those defenses that may exist. So we have learned a lot from this pandemic. And I think one of the most important takeaways is that we have to change the way that we've done business in the past. We have to recognize that we can do business differently. There are different approaches that can be taken. It has been proven throughout the pandemic. It's just whether we have the courage within the criminal justice arena, with the judges, with the law enforcement officials, and with the state attorney to make those different decisions about who needs to be in jail pre-trial.
So, Ricardo, I want to bring you in on this because obviously your jurisdiction is massive. 10 million people living there. A quarter of California's population is there. And you're also in this kind of transformative moment. I'd love for you to pick up on some of the stuff that Gordon was just saying about the capacity of the pandemic to be a demonstrative project, right? Because we are a country that has historically incarcerated people for like walking while black at the drop of a hat. On masses of bail that people can't pay. But you're now at a moment where you've got a new prosecutor across the table and possibly, the demonstration of that COVID has created, as well as other new initiatives. One of the things we've learned is that text messages are incredibly effective at getting people to come back to court. I heard from a company called Uptrust that one of the things they hear back from people when they text them to remind them is that people say thank you and show up. It seems like there's a lot of alternatives that are out there. And I'm wondering if you can kind of dig into, in the context of your county, where you think the takeaways are. What are the lessons? What do county officials need to be hearing?
I appreciate that. No, I think Los Angeles is very much in a milestone place, a new direction, which is incredibly exciting. Before the pandemic, our office had been pioneering some of those very programs you talked about. We partnered with Uptrust and the National Bail Project to show that if you provided individuals with that kind of support, that communication, and got them out of custody, that they would come back to court. And we were seeing incredible success rates for both those projects, and the high 90% success. And in fact, in Compton, where we piloted the bail project, we were seeing the highest success in return rates for not just misdemeanors, but felons as well, anywhere in the country. And so when the pandemic arrived and we saw this radical change in the way we were looking at incarceration for the first time by many of the other justice stakeholders, we were able to lean on these existing models and show now in a larger scale that if you let people out, that was not going to increase the level of violent crime in the community, and that in fact, if people were given the resources and that simple text message or that phone call, they in fact would return to court. And so there was a coordinated effort here in Los Angeles amongst the justice stakeholders early on, similar to what it sounds like happened in Broward County, where we looked at what was going on in the jails, the potential harm that could happen to our community members, and coordinated together to keep people from coming in, but not just that, release as many people as we could convince the prosecutor and the sheriff's department to release. And also here in California, we were lucky that the Chief Justice created a zero bail order, which allowed for individuals who were not charged with serious or violent felonies, and some particular other situations, to be released automatically on bail. And so we were able to decarcerate a great number of individuals, bringing those numbers significantly down, as you alluded to. We also stand right now in the notion that community priority is a reform for justice in Los Angeles County. And while we do have these wonderful projects and inventive initiatives designed to move us in a more progressive direction, there's a change that we need to understand. The public defender's offices, whether here in LA or anywhere else in the country, are always at the center of any action that impacts the indigent accused. There's a paradigm shift. In LA, we are again lucky to have this idea supported by our board of supervisors, about care first, jails last. And that has really become the mantra of change in Los Angeles. The Alternatives to Incarceration Project, looking at ways to fund resources in the community so that individuals don't even have to have contact with the criminal legal system, to look at the underlying causes as to why so many people find themselves arrested or behind bars, that we can address before they even come up, and all along that continuum of care. We have the Office of Diversion and Reentry that has been working for many years to find people that are in custody who shouldn't be there because of mental illness, substance abuse usage, and pull them out through the help, obviously, of public defender lawyers. These opportunities are really transforming the way we look at our criminal legal system in Los Angeles and allowing us to partner together, because none of this is done alone. And what we're seeing is a need for a paradigm shift away from a system that prioritizes the prosecution and incarceration to one that prioritizes funding community-based support and indigent defense representation, public defender's offices. Because the reality is that these changes that we're all talking about now and that we can see, and that COVID has allowed us to really wrap our brains around in a practical way to see that you can remove people from jail. All these initiatives depend on a public defender being robust, a public defender being supported, and a public defender being at the forefront of that communication. Because regardless of what we're doing to get people out of custody, whenever you have to convince a judge to decarcerate, that person needs an attorney there to advocate on their behalf. And when we're talking about the indigent accused, we all know that that is the public defender's office. We're seeing a sea change in that way here in Los Angeles. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible optimism we have when it comes to decarceration with the election of George Gaston as our district attorney. He has brought a hope, I think, for the greater part of LA that could not be seen before. And what is wonderful about what he's doing and what he promises to do is that it speaks to initiatives that public defenders have been advocating forever. I don't think there's a public defender in the state of California that hasn't been asking that their individual DA stop using sentencing enhancements as a way to add punishment to individuals and disregard the underlying offense and focus on ways to force pleas out of people. I don't think there's a public defender who hasn't been begging their district attorney to stop charging children as adults and treat them as children, giving them the opportunity to play and reintegrate into life in a way that we would want our own children to. If they
You're never going to have to convince me to boost treating kids like kids. Absolutely. I want to take it back really quickly to Jerry, though, because you mentioned this really interesting dichotomy, right? Which is the power of the public defender to create change versus the power of progressive prosecutors. And Jerry, I have to ask you to be quick on this one because I want to loop back to Gordon before he's got to go. So I'm making everybody stay on time. But I want to ask you, you noticed in your reporting that progressive prosecutors, progressive jurisdictions like Philadelphia, for example, still had problems with jail populations rising during the pandemic. So this might not be something that a progressive prosecutor alone can fix. Can you talk to us about what's getting in the way there and whether that comes back to public defender power?
Absolutely. So as you said, Philadelphia is another jurisdiction where the jail population shrank during the first half of 2020 and then rose essentially back up to the same level by the end of the year. And in that city, you have Larry Krasner as the district attorney, who is essentially one of the first people to run as a quote unquote progressive prosecutor. And what you're seeing in the jail system, and again, I can't account for, there are a lot of jurisdictions where there are COVID slowdowns to blame in some ways. There are jail transfers that were halted in some jurisdictions. So I can't say that this is the only reason, but if you look at the types of people that even DA Krasner was willing to release early, there was a hard wall when it came to quote unquote violent offenders or folks on gun charges. And there was just sort of a hard wall of people that even Krasner's office seemingly is just not willing to release pre-trial during the pandemic. And I think it, in terms of the role of public defenders, you asked, I mean, there is a large public conversation that needs to be had about, what does it mean to be charged and innocent till proven guilty, even if it means perhaps a violent crime? What type of punishment as a society are we willing to impose on those sorts of people, even if they haven't been convicted yet? And that's just a conversation that isn't happening even in quote unquote the more progressive jurisdictions, including Philadelphia.
So, Gordon, turning back to your jurisdiction for a second, you're quoted in the article as saying that no one has learned a thing from the pandemic. And I'm wondering if you could list for us, because I know you do have a hard stop and I don't want to let you go, but I know I have to. I'm wondering if you could list for us some of the things you want your jurisdiction to have taken away from this and what you think, if they were to be able to carry it forward into the years to come, would strengthen the community and their safety.
It's very easy to recognize that there are different approaches to incarceration pre-trial. We learned that folks can be released for minor offenses, and there is not an increase in threat to the community safety. And if we can just embody that in all decision making going forward, then we would have a better opportunity to address this system in a more holistic and equitable manner. We find that there is a court tax associated with every arrest, and that is often bared more harshly on the indigent because they cannot afford to bond out of jail before their case comes to trial. And that court tax is all the time that they're sitting in jail, whether presumed innocent, hopefully waiting for this slow and arduous process to give them their day in court. There's some harsh realities to the court system. It is a very complicated maze that takes a lot of effort to see your way through. And you need to have a very strong and effective and strong advocate working for you through, oftentimes it's the public defender making those calls and making those arguments on your behalf. But what we have to recognize is there shouldn't be that judicial tax, that tax that is always levied on the poor and oftentimes communities of color because they cannot afford the monetary bond. So the court system needs to look at what it's doing and how it is addressing pretrial release. And the reality is the pandemic has shown us that pretrial release does not equate to an increase in crime. It does not equate to a lack of returning to court to hear or to address your matter. It's shown us that the system can still accomplish its goal, which is assuring that the person reappear, address their matter, and they have some finality and some conclusion. So should there be this inherent judicial tax that levies punishment pre-trial, whether innocent or guilty? I think that's what we have to take away, that we have to find a better path, a more equitable path that ensures that folks are not receiving that punishment pre-trial that's associated with being locked away in jail when you are innocent before proven guilty. And that is the ultimate takeaway. I echo the comments of my public defender brother in LA. You have to recognize the importance of the work that public defenders do, the conscience of the community that we bring to bear in court when we advocate for these issues. It is incumbent that our system recognize the principle upon which it was founded, and that is equity and fairness for all. But we have recognized the disparities that exist in this system time and time again. We recognize the communities that they impact at a far greater rate than most others, and we recognize how those folks of wealth and affluence get a different type of justice. And we have to make sure that we fix those inequitable parts of our system and make sure that it's fair for all.
Thank you so much for that, Gordon. I know you have to go. I hope the two remaining folks will stick around for just 1 minute, because I do have one more question for each of you, if you are able. I'd like to go to you, Ricardo, because thank you so much, Gordon, for joining us. Ricardo, I want to ask you, what Gordon was just talking about and what you were talking about a minute ago, and I think what Jerry's been reporting on about the lack of prosecutorial omnipotence here. There's this other issue that I think we need to drill into a bit, which is the issue of court delay. Now, I remember very fondly from my days practicing in California that California has a wonderful speedy trial rule. You can't just languish indefinitely in a California jail. You get to demand your day in court, say, I'm going to trial, time not waived, and they have to give you your trial within 60 days if you're in custody on a serious case. Now, I understand that there are people who, because of COVID, have had their trial, their right to do that, suspended indefinitely, with one person sitting in since last March. A case that was supposed to go to trial last March has been in pandemic limbo, just like the rest of us, except for that person is spending their pandemic limbo in a jail where their life is at risk daily. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about this sort of Kafkaesque situation and how you're going to be able to move forward from this sort of molasses in the wheels of the justice system.
That's a fantastic question, because I think, as Gordon was talking about the lessons we've learned about the pandemic and the decarceration, and the fact that releasing people for low-level offenses doesn't create an additional threat or danger in the community. The lesson that we haven't learned yet is the impact of delaying trials, stopping trials, certainly in Los Angeles County, the lesson that's going to have on our criminal legal system moving forward. I've objected to every single delay that our court has asked for since the beginning of the pandemic, because every time the court has granted that delay and trials don't happen, our clients languish in jail, as you mentioned, without the only real recourse they have to address the accusation, which is a day in court. The Sixth Amendment stands for that, the right of the individual who's accused, who's presumed innocent, as you've mentioned, to address their accusers in court and force the government to prove that case against them beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the foundation of our criminal legal system. That is what public defenders and other defense attorneys stand for when they go to trial, and is the way that you pressure test the system, force the government to prove its case. And what we've done here is stop that. Los Angeles has said the safety and health of individuals, which is valid. It's a difficult situation to balance, that supersedes the fundamental constitutional rights of an individual to go to trial. We have litigated that question in our courts, and we have lost, unfortunately, that question. We had a brief window where trials resumed in Los Angeles. Only 125 or so took place, 5% of what we normally do every year. And we were able to, the public defender's office did the very first COVID trial, as it were, in Los Angeles. And we did it successfully in the sense that we did it safely. We were able to demonstrate that you could still protect an individual's fundamental constitutional right to go to trial, and also protect the health and safety of the individuals who are part of that process. And there could be a balance of that question. However, soon after that, we saw a surge in cases in LA, and we saw a stoppage to trials with no date unknown, with no sort of release in the future as to when we were going to be able to begin to litigate those cases. That backlog, that pressure of cases that are sitting in the system that we are waiting to see, is going to be an unknown deluge of chaos, quite frankly, that is going to impact not just my attorneys and their day-to-day work, which is already incredibly overwhelming, but that of every other justice stakeholder, from the court to the district attorney, city attorneys, court clerks, sheriffs, everyone who's part of this process, who's been sort of kicking the can down the road, is going to be forced to answer the question of what do we do with the people who demand their trial today and those individuals who are coming in. That's who we're seeing stuck in the system. That is a lesson that I hope we realize, that God forbid we're ever in a situation like this again, we don't suspend those constitutional rights. We don't support, we certainly didn't support that, but everybody in the criminal justice system stands up and says, no, these individuals deserve their day in court. We must continue with trials. Because other counties have done that in California. Other counties have continued to have trials, and they've been able to do so, from my understanding, safely, and maintain a more reasonable number of cases processing through.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, actually, mentioning the other counties reminds me that I did want to, and I know we've got, okay, last question. I know we've got to wrap up. But speaking of the other counties, Jerry, I know that in your reporting, you've been thinking about how this fits into the broader picture of decarceration, right? Some of the arguments that advocates have been making in the COVID context fit into a larger picture of arguments that people who study safety, public safety, the criminal legal system have been making about what the future of our system should look like. And I'm wondering if, in closing, you could quickly tell us the takeaways here for the bigger picture of the path to decarceration.
Well, I would say, I echo much of what was just said. I would say that, this should have been a learning experience around the country that, there's just so much scaremongering that is done by whether it's police unions, whether it's prosecutors associations, whether it's local politicians, so much scaremongering that is done about bail reform, about pretrial release, about any type of way to decarcerate the system. And the pandemic should have shown that there was no real corresponding rise in crime, rise in, frankly, most issues with when it came to releasing people early in the first half of last year. And we had a concrete example of what happens when you release people. And so much of the scaremongering that is done, especially by police unions and prosecutors, just didn't come to pass. And instead of that being the catalyst for a larger movement to continue these releases, I think people sort of took their foot off the gas in a lot of ways. And instead of pushing, to see how much more we can do to change the system, I think people just kind of clapped their hands and didn't keep pushing forward. And I just think this, frankly, could have been a perfect example and should be a perfect example moving forward of the fact that, changing these things and rethinking the way justice is served in America doesn't have to immediately mean that cities are going to burn down and catch fire, which seems to, frankly, be what a lot of police unions and prosecutors tell people and tell the public to scaremonger about these changes. And, I think it's perfect ammunition to come back to these people and say, well, the things you're basically spewing aren't true, and we can change the system without destroying the rest of America.
Well, you heard it here, folks. First of all, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Ricardo, for sticking around late. Really appreciate you. Did not want to miss out on a moment of your knowledge. So thank you so much for sticking with us. I hope we'll get to see you both again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there you have it, right? At the beginning of the pandemic last year, though many officials were initially very unwilling to do more, there were some officials who stepped up and analyzed the population of people who were being held in jails without being convicted of any crime, and made efforts to let people go home to be safe with their families. We had a moment of clarity. And in that moment of clarity, you just heard from Jerry that crime did not rise, cities were not on fire. We stayed safe with more people coming to court because someone text messaged them instead of because they were being held in a cage and then put on a bus. So in a matter of months, though, even witnessing the safety that was fostered, perhaps not being aware of family unity that they created, the possibility for people to continue work if they were able or continue their schooling, these officials took their foot off the gas pedal. Even as the pandemic did not. The pandemic, I repeat, has not abated. It is still going on. It has even worsened. But over the last half of 2020, even though the pandemic worsened, jails in many jurisdictions started filling right back up, returning to their pre-pandemic levels or even going higher. As Gordon Weeks, the chief public defender who we just heard from in Broward County, Florida, told us, apparently nobody learned anything from that lesson. But we have to. On any given day, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people sitting in jails across the country who simply do not need to be there. Most have not been convicted of a crime. And the vast majority would be able to wait out their case at home with their family if they just had money. Bail, after all, is just money to buy your freedom. However, officials continue insisting on filling these jails with people. Why? As we heard from Ricardo García, it destroys lives, erodes justice, and this is important. It damages public safety. It destroys people's economic mobility. It destroys family unity. And the public safety question is key because that's why these officials are insisting that jails need to be filled in the first place. They're telling you that in order for you to be safe, the jail in your city has to be bursting. Well, we learned last year that that's just not true. And if they're trying to prove a point that's already been proven wrong by putting people's lives at risk in a COVID hotspot behind bars during an historic, deadly pandemic, that's just indefensible. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. You can find us here. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook. And we look forward to seeing you next time.